To begin, remove the lug bolts and front wheel from the vehicle. Remove the tie rod arm from the steering knuckle by removing the nut and bolt holding the tie rod to the steering knuckle. It may be necessary to tap the bracket with a mallet to fully remove the tie rod end. Next, disconnect the sway bar end link from the lower control arm. Unclip the bracket holding the leveling sensor to the driver's side control arm. You can now remove the nut and bolt holding the strut fork to the hub of the vehicle. Under the hood, remove the rubber seal trim around the cowl cover by pulling the seal upwards. Once the seal is removed, pull the cowl cover towards the front of the vehicle to remove. For ease of access, move the expansion tank by removing the Phillips screw, lifting the front of the tank, and pulling forward. Remove the 3 bolts at the top of the strut tower holding the top mount to the vehicle. 2 of these bolts will not be easy to access, so use of an extension will be necessary. The 2 upper suspension arms will need to be removed from the top mount. Each arm is held in by 1 bolt and nut. The front suspension can now be removed from the wheel well. The upper mount and bushing will need to be used with the Raceland coilover. Remove the single nut from the top of the strut to free the top mount. Place the OEM top mount with bump stop and dust cover onto the Raceland coilover. Slide the retaining spacer onto the piston and place the upper bushing onto the shock piston. With the supplied nut, tighten the top mount to the Raceland coilover. Place the coilover into the wheel well. You will install the upper arms on the top mounts before bolting the bottom mount to the shock tower. Reinstall the 2 nuts and bolts to secure the arms into place. Lift the coilover into place and reinstall the 3 bolts holding the top mount to the strut tower. Move the expansion tank into place and reinstall the front screw to hold it into place. Place the cowl and battery covers back into place and push the rubber weather seals into place onto the seam. Lift the hub and slide the bolt through the coilover fork and tighten the coilover mount to the control arm. Clip the leveling sensor to the control arm. Reattach the sway bar end link to the control. Push the tie rod end into the steering knuckle and reinstall the bolt holding the tie rod into place. Tighten the bolt, pinching the tie rod end to the steering knuckle. You can now reinstall the wheel as the installation for this corner is complete. To begin the rear installation, remove the wheel from the vehicle. You will need to remove the fender liner to gain access to the top of the rear shock. Remove the hex bolts holding the liner to the wheel well, then remove it from the vehicle. Remove the bolt holding the bottom of the shock to the control arm. Remove the 2 bolts holding the rear upper strut mount to the vehicle. You can now remove the strut from the wheel well. To make removal of the rear spring easier, loosen the bolts holding the rear subframe to the vehicle. Do not remove these bolts completely and take caution to only back out the bolt by approximately 3/4 of an inch. Remove the bolt holding the leveling sensor to the control arm. Remove the nut and bolt holding the upper control arm to the hub of the vehicle. You now should have enough drop to the suspension that the rear spring can be pried from the spring seat and removed from the vehicle. Install the coilover spring by placing the upper rubber insulator onto the top of the spring and then the adjustment perch onto the bottom of the spring and set into position. Tighten the rear subframe bolts to secure the subframe to the body of the vehicle. Move the upper control arm back into place on the hub and reinstall the nut and bolt. Reattach the leveling sensor to the control arm with the factory bolt. To install the rear strut, remove the bolt holding the rear top mount to the shock piston. Slide the bump stop and dust cover onto the Raceland stock, followed by the retaining washer. Place the rear strut mount onto the shock and secure it with the supplied nut. Position the rear shock into position in the wheel well and reinstall the 2 bolts holding the strut mount to the vehicle. You can now bolt the lower shock to the hub of the vehicle. Be sure to place the supplied washers onto the shock bushing before installation. Place the fender liner back into place and secure with the factory hex bolts. You can now reinstall the rear wheel as the installation for this corner is complete.